All right, again, Daniel 9, verses 20 through 27. Now, last week we covered Daniel 9, verses 1 through 23. I don't think that's right, is it? Nope, that wasn't right. We got close to 23, but we didn't get there. But what we covered in those verses was Daniel going to the Lord in prayer. And we know that this is during the time of King Darius from the Medes, partnered with the Persians who have overthrown the Babylonian Empire. The very empire that destroyed the Promised Land, the very empire that crushed the temple, the very empire that enslaved God's people for 70 years, which is what God prophesied was going to happen. And why? Because God's people continue to rebel against Him. And like I said, this shouldn't have been a surprise for the people of God because God warned them time and time and time again that this was going to happen. He spoke through the prophet Isaiah about the 70 years. But he also prophesied that it was going only to last 70 years. And it's in the verses that we went through last week that Daniel not only is on his face praying for his people, praying for himself and their wickedness and how they have sinned against God and how gracious and merciful God, how holy He is. But we're also told that Daniel goes to the Scripture to find comfort. And we're specifically told, and this is very important, that he went to the book of Jeremiah. And we also know that it's in the book of Jeremiah that also speaks of the 70 years coming to an end. Babylon's king is going to be overthrown. And that's what Daniel is experiencing right now. The king has been overthrown. We also know that Daniel has covered himself in sackcloth and ashes in repentance. It's in this prayer, too, that he lifts up and recognizes the holiness of God, the greatness of God, the awesomeness of God. But also it is God who is the covenant keeper. Why? Because if it was up to man, there would be no covenant. We break it all the time. Again, he speaks of the sins of his people, how they've acted wickedly against God, ignored the prophets, aggressively disobeyed the commandments. And Daniel in his prayer makes it perfectly clear that he agrees with everything that God has done, because they deserve his wrath. But it's also in the prayer last week that that Daniel calls out for God's mercy, for His grace. And he knows that it's only through God's mercy and grace that this promise is going to be filled, that they are going to be set free after the 70 years. But not through anything that they have done. It's all through God. All right. It's in these upcoming verses that's caused quite a bit of controversy throughout the church, throughout the years, and the understanding of the end times. And the one thing that I do not want to do, because there's brilliant people on both sides, whether you're a dispensationalist or whether you fall in the camp of an all-mill or post-mill, brilliant men on both sides. And I want you to understand that I'm coming to these verses in all humility here, and I'm going to tell you something. I may not have this right. I may not. But I have wrestled and wrestled and wrestled with it, and Wednesday night at 7 o'clock is now upon us, so here we are. I do fall in line with more of the understanding of the all-mill, post-mill camp. But please understand that I'm not attacking the dispensationalists here. I'm not going to call them heretics. I believe that they have done the best that they can do as well. And that's what they have come up with. I believe that there is a clear understanding to these verses, though. I'm afraid it's man throughout the years we've muddied up the waters. And listen, tonight I may even throw more dirt in that mud puddle, but we're going to do the best we can, okay? okay? Now, just a refresher, we're in the apocalyptic writing style of Daniel. And it's in this type of writing that there are going to be times when symbols, figures, and numbers are going to be used to help us in the understanding of what's being laid out. However, it is symbols. I'm going to go ahead and just jump to the end and let you all know I do not believe that these are literal numbers being used. I do not believe it's saying 70 times 7 is 490 years, and then we have to figure out at what point in time the temple is being built to see if that adds up to when Christ has actually been born into this world, or whether it's when Christ has gone to the cross. Again, we are reading apocalyptic writing. We have to treat it that way. If this was historical writing, if this was a narrative, we would treat it differently. But there's also something else going on in this translation that we're reading. And listen, I'm no Hebrew scholar, so I have to rely upon Hebrew scholars as we work through this. But there's something rare that happens in these upcoming verses. And again, I say this in humility. But I kind of wonder why in the English translation that they change it to 70 weeks instead of leaving it in its original language 77s. That's how it was originally penned. But here we have it laid out as 70 weeks. And I think there may be an answer to this, and we'll get to that here in a moment. But I want you to remember what God has promised Daniel and Jeremiah. He has promised them that it is a literal 70 years when it comes to them being enslaved and the time in which they're going to be set free. It very well could be that in this prayer that Daniel is praying, and remember he's reading the book of Jeremiah, it very well could be that his hope is that at the end of this 70 years of enslavement, the new covenant is going to start taking form. But I believe the way in which this is written, and with Gabriel coming to explain this to him, he's letting Daniel know it's going to be over a long period of time before that happens. Which is why we get the different the 70 70s, the 62 70s, and so on and so on. And hopefully we can clear that up as we start making our way through this. Again, not stepping on my dispensationalist brothers and sisters here, but I think there's times when we start multiplying numbers to try and figure out how to match up this event taking place. I think we end up focusing more on the secondary and tertiary issues while missing the primary. Again, we are in the second half of the book of Daniel, that being the chapters 7 through 12, written in apocalyptic writing. That's extremely important for us to keep that in context. The use of symbols and images are being used to help illustrate a message. And the reason why I say this, because the people during that time of Daniel, when he was laying out this vision, they weren't literally looking for goats and rams with horns falling off, another one growing in place, 4 more coming from here, an eyeball being off center. That's not what they were doing. Again, apocalyptic writing. Do you get my point and where I'm going with this, or am I just beating a dead horse here? Okay, here we go. You may be disappointed at the end of this message, but it won't be the first time, so here we are. While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my plea before the Lord my God for the holy hill of my God. Now, this is summarizing what we read about last week in that wonderful prayer. If you weren't here last week, go back and read verses 1 through 19. It's just brilliant. So that prayer, of course, was Daniel on behalf of himself and his people. He was repenting to God for their wickedness and how they had broken his covenant just over and over and over again. And again, this 70 years is coming to an end. Daniel's probably in his 80s about this point in time. The Persians and the Medes have overthrown Babylon. Babylon's king is now dead. And again, I do think there's a hope in Daniel that he's going to see this new covenant usher in at the end of this literal, hear me, literal 70 years of the enslavement. If you will, let's look at a couple of verses that Daniel would have been reading from in Jeremiah 31 through 33. Again, I think it's very important for us to keep in context what was said that he was reading the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 33. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke. Though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Do we grasp what Jeremiah is saying here? He's talking about Christ. He's talking about the New Testament, this new covenant being ushered in by the Messiah. Again, is this what Daniel is hoping for? Because we know through the prayer, verses 1 through 19, we know that he prayed for the Jewish people to be restored, for the temple to be rebuilt, and for the heart of man to be changed. Well, we know that Daniel longs to witness the rebelling of God's people come to an end, for them to submit to him, to fully worship him. And we know that Daniel cannot wait for this time to happen. But I think what Gabriel is going to explain to Daniel is that this is in God's timing and not yours. Again, this is why the context is so important, which is why verses 1 through 19 leading up to this help us out. And there's nothing wrong with Daniel wanting to see this transformation now. I mean, that's what he's longing, is for God's people to return back to him. But that's not God's plan. Now look at verse 21. While I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening service. Now, look at how God deals with Daniel's beautiful prayer. He sends Gabriel in a swift manner, and Daniel isn't even finished praying yet. And yet God's like, I hear you. I hear you. Before you even finish your prayer, I know what you're praying for, Daniel. Verse 22, he says, he made me understand, speaking with me and saying, "O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding." The Lord knows exactly what you are wanting, Daniel. The Lord knows that you're wanting your people to lay down their idolatry, to lay down their wickedness against God. No more desecration in the house of the Lord once it's been rebuilt. He hears you, Daniel. Verse 23, at the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out. So as soon as Daniel starts praying this prayer, God the Father looks at Gabriel and says, all right, you're going to go talk to this fella. All right. And I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. You see the heart that Daniel has for God's people. And now here Gabriel saying, now let's help you understand this transformation amongst God's people and how this is going to take place. Because that's what he's praying for. Apocalyptic writing. Symbols. Images. But just because it's apocalyptic writing, don't think that these numbers are just arbitrary. There is a meaning behind these numbers that Daniel and the people of that time would have understood. If you will, let's go. I know what some of you are thinking. How long are we going to be here? Doesn't matter. It does, I get it. But if you will, let's go to Leviticus 25, verses 8 through 12. Okay, remember the numbers, right? The year of Jubilee. You shall count 7 weeks of years. 7 times 7 years. So the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement, and you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. That 50th year shall be jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather the grapes from the undressed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. When we look at the prophecy given to Daniel, we need to consider a few important factors, if you will. The prophecy of the 70 weeks is a clear message about how God is going to take away the issue of human sin that brings about the covenant curse. This shows that the prophecy is all about the covenant and the Messiah, pointing to a time after this set period is over. And if you will think of it as the ultimate jubilee and an everlasting Sabbath. An everlasting day of peace. In simpler terms, the 77s that God has set mean that once the period of exile is complete and the 6 conditions have been met, and we're going to get to those 6 conditions. I know what you're thinking, Britt. But here are the 6 conditions that had to be met. To finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Who does that sound like? The ultimate jubilee will arrive along with the promised eternal rest for God's people after those 6 have been met. Okay, now we're diving into verse 24. And you're thinking, we don't have that many more verses left. 70 weeks, or in the original writing, 77s, are decreed about your people and your holy city. Here comes the 6. To finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. If sometimes I say 77s instead of what's written, you know where I'm coming from, right? We're just holding on to the original. I hold that this 77s is speaking of a long period of time. Remember, because Daniel and the crew are about to come out of 70 years of enslavement. So he's thinking, maybe this is it. Maybe this is what Jeremiah was writing about. But no. 77s. Daniel, your people are going to return home. The land is going to be restored along with the temple. But there's so much more that needs to happen over a longer period of time than what you are hoping for. The new covenant is going to be ushered in. God's perfect plan will continue to unfold to the point to where there will be an end to sin. Iniquity will be atoned for once and for all, and it will be replaced by an everlasting righteousness. And God's people will be sealed with his ownership upon them. And in all of this, also the visions of the prophets will be fulfilled. Again, what's this pointing to? And all of this is going to happen through the coming of the Anointed One. Now look at verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. What Gabriel is telling Daniel is the first little piece of the 77s. Your people are going to be returned home. The Holy Land will be restored. The promise that God has made is going to happen. Continuing, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 sevens or 7 weeks. Again, this is speaking on the first section of time of the 77s. People are set free, return back to the land. And then there's the mention of this prince, an anointed one here. These first years that Gabriel is breaking down is more than likely, hear me when I say that, more than likely I'm not going to die on this hill, okay? But more than likely it's referring to Ezra's ministry. And this is what I mean by that, because it's during Ezra's ministry, it is when he will guide the people of Judah in rebuilding the temple and renewing the sacrifices in the first section of time. And Ezra comes from a priestly lineage, tracing all the way back to Aaron. We see this in Ezra 7, 1 through 5. Now, the term prince used by Daniel signifies a notable leader or priestly figure. This era probably also includes Nehemiah, who rebuilt Jerusalem, and Malachi, the last author of the Old Testament. And remember, there is a long stretch of time from the time of Malachi to the time when Gabriel speaks to Mary. So, the first 7 weeks, period of time, 7 sevens, could possibly extend from right around 538 BC to around 445 BC when Ezra was active, okay? Small chunk of time. Now look, and for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. So here we have the 62 sevens. Now we're in the moment in which all of Jerusalem has been rebuilt, including the temple. However, this probably isn't what Daniel wanted to hear, because he's thinking, okay, now we're probably getting to the point where the new covenant is about to start. The temple has been rebuilt. Judah is thriving again. But there's still turmoil, rebellion, and wicked acts continuing during the time of the second temple. The false teachings of the religious leaders hasn't gone away. Destruction by way of rebellion through God's people continues. It's looking similar to what took place during the time of the first temple. Again, this is Gabriel telling Daniel it's going to take time. Now look at verse 26. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. Temple standing, has been for a while now. Where are we in the timeline? The Messiah is here. Jesus is walking the earth. The new covenant is now being brought through his life, death, and his resurrection. We're working our way through Mark now. We're almost 3 years into the ministry of Jesus, and what do we see? People come and listen. They like seeing the miracles, but they don't really like what he's saying. They're wanting this king who's going to overthrow Rome, not a king who's going to crush sin. They don't want the suffering servant. So they reject him. He is cut off. He's not embraced. He is rejected. All to fulfill God's perfect plan. Again, this is what Daniel has longed for, but he's not going to be around to see it. It's going to take time. Continuing, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. Now, what many of us grew up with right here is the understanding that this prince is the Antichrist, who comes to destroy all that which is holy and righteous, right? And again, I love our dispensational brothers and sisters. They have a strong desire to please the Lord with this interpretation. And again, in all humility, this just doesn't line up contextually, though. We can't overlook the context in the earlier verses of chapter 9 from his praying and how he's wanting his people to be a part of this new covenant, to be in submission to the Lord, to repent. And we also can't overlook that it specifically mentions the book of Jeremiah. Daniel is longing for God's covenant to be fulfilled. So I hold that what Gabriel is doing here is showing Daniel the way in which the new covenant is going to be ushered into this world. And it's going to be through Jesus, not the Antichrist here. The prince is Jesus. It's Jesus' ministry, his 3-year ministry, his priestly work in those 3 years. And it's God's own people who reject him. And through their rejection, what does God do? He uses Rome, much like Babylon, to end Jerusalem once and for all. But not just Jerusalem. He destroys the temple and the Jewish faith. Why? Because Christ has fulfilled the temple. He is the perfect fulfillment of the sacrifices and the offerings, and he is the new covenant understanding. Look at verse 27. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to the sacrifice and offering. Okay. Again, what our dispensational brothers and sisters hold to is that this is still speaking of the Antichrist, making a covenant with the people. And by way of making this covenant, he ends the sacrificial system and the offerings. But that's not what we're seeing here. If you will, where it says, with many for 1 7 and half of the 7, all this is talking about now is the fulfillment coming to an end, the end of the 70 70s, the 70 weeks, if you will. Jesus' life on this earth was short, a small amount of time compared to 70 70s. But this is Jesus fulfilling the new covenant in the end. And he fulfills it in the half of the 7s, that being what? The kangaroo court, the beating he received, and when they nailed him to the cross. That day, he paid everyone's sin debt in full, which means what? At the same time, through the cross, ending sacrifices and offerings. He shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. This isn't about the Antichrist. There is no need for the temple, the sacrifices, or the offerings now. He completed it. Hold that second. Hold that, okay? Hold it. Because what happened that day? What happened in the temple? The veil was torn in two through what Christ did on the cross. The 77s is coming to an end. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. As the Jewish people continue to rebel and mock God, in spite of the new covenant in which Jesus has ushered in, taught, and fulfilled, the Jewish people will continue to reject God by way of rejecting the Messiah. Which does what? Leads to the destruction of Jerusalem. Although abomination continued through their sins, the mercy of God prevails through the Son. We close with this. Once the 70 weeks are over, we'll enter the ultimate Jubilee. Our sins will be forgiven, and we'll be freed from slavery to sin. Heaven and earth will be restored, expanding the promised land to include the entire earth. Finally, we'll enter our eternal rest with God as our time of exile ends. All right. Again, coming to you in all humility here. Wrestle, 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 and this is where I landed. All right? Questions?